Welcome to my presentation on calculating VAT called the decimal way. This presentation is a short presentation about calculating VAT and there are a few ways of being able to work out what the net, gross and VAT amounts are of a figure and it can be worked out in these different ways, but I always find the decimal way is the most reliable because VAT rates can change. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in that on the next few slides. Okay, so just before we start on the calculating VAT, I just want to go through just the basics of what VAT is, just as a recap for those that have already studied it, and just as an overview for those who perhaps don't know too much about it. So what is VAT? VAT means value added tax. It's essentially a consumption tax that's applied to most goods and services within the EU. Everything that I'm talking about today will be based on UK VAT. It's important to note that rates can change. So in 2011, it went up to 20%, and originally before that, the VAT rate was 17.5%. So always bear in mind that VAT rates can actually change. And prices can be including or excluding VAT, okay? So when you have a price, normally things that are trade prices tend to be excluding VAT, but things that are in your shops in the UK, things that you purchase online are generally including VAT. But it's always worth looking out for the signs and that may tell you that it is excluding VAT. So please also apply this to your exams. Check the figures that you're given and see whether it says whether it's including VAT, excluding VAT, because depending on what it is will depend on how you need to work things out. Okay, so what's the terminology then when we are talking about VAT? So we've got net, VAT and gross. So what means what? Your VAT is the actual amount of tax that is on the item or the goods or the services that you're buying or selling. Your net amount is the cost of the item without VAT. So that's key here, that it's without VAT, so it's before you add your VAT on. And then your gross is the total amount that you are going to pay or receive, which is inclusive of VAT. So the gross amount is the total of net and VAT. Okay, so you might see this as written like including VAT, it might be VAT inclusive, that sort of terminology, or you might see it as the gross amount. If it's the gross amount, then it's including VAT. If you're having trouble in remembering what's what, then perhaps you can give this a go. So we've got gross, net and VAT, and the way I like to look at it here is that this word here, gross, is the largest word out of the three. Okay, so you can see this word here has got more letters than net and it's got more letters than VAT. So I like to think of this as the largest. Okay, so if it's the largest, it needs to include the net and it needs to include the VAT. So you can think of it a little bit like you've got a box and the box is going to be the largest thing because you're going to put things in it, so it's got to be big enough to keep things going in it. So then therefore you're going to have your net going in it and your VAT amount going in as well. So just try and think of it about what is the largest, and the most visual way of doing that is that the gross amount, the word gross, is the largest out of the three. So therefore that must mean that it's your net and your VAT included. So calculating VAT. So some common mistakes is currently the VAT rate in the UK is 20%. And when I was at college first studying AAT level 2, my tutor was teaching the sort of divide by 6 times by 5 method to calculate the net. I never really got my head around this because I thought it was always more of a dangerous way to do it, because that only works if the VAT rate is 20%. So I always think that you need to go in a more consistent way. So I don't tend to use that way. So I'm going to show you the decimal way shortly. And another common mistake is not making the correct distinction about what the individual terms mean. So just like we've gone through it, the gross is all of it, the net and the VAT are the two things that make up the gross. Okay, so sometimes people are adding VAT onto the gross amount, or they're taking it off the net amount, which is obviously going to be the wrong way round. So just think about the common mistakes that can happen to try and prevent yourself from doing it. So the decimal way then, the decimal way is all about using VAT in a way where you can multiply something by a decimal. Okay, so 20% VAT rate in the UK, as I said, and that in a decimal is 0.2. So a little bit later, I'm going to show you how to work through some examples by using the decimal way and why it remains consistent. Because remember, VAT rates can change, and they can be different in different countries as well. So this way it means you're always going to be able to calculate your VAT. Okay, so thinking about your VAT. So depending on where you are in your studies, you might have come across markup and margin, you might have come across different elements of costing and things where you have to think about what is 100% of your cost. So this is how I think about VAT. I think about that your net is your 100%. Okay, so this is how I'm going to break it down into the decimal way. So your net is 100%. So 100% is going to be 1. Okay, so if we just put that into practice, if we have, say we have an item and we're going to say this item that we're going to work through on this slide, and it costs £10. Okay, so we're going to say that if we wanted to know the net of that figure, all we would have to do is 10 times 1, because the net is 100%. Okay, and that's really important that you understand that you understand how that 1 comes into being. Okay, so we would then know it's £10. Our VAT rate is going to be 20%. So the way we know how to work out the decimal is going to be that you're going to divide the 20% by, or the 20, you're going to divide 20 by 100, because that's what percent means, and as a decimal form that comes out at 0.2. So in order to calculate what our VAT would be on this £10 item, we would then say, well, our VAT is 0.2, so therefore it's going to be our net amount. So we're going back to here because that's our 100%. It's our net amount multiplied by our VAT amount here. And you're then going to work that out, because that will then give you the figure that you're going to be adding on in terms to then make your gross amount. Okay, so your 10 times 0.2 is going to be £2. And then moving on to the last bit, if you've got your net at 100%, your VAT at 20%, then your gross has to be 120%. Okay, so we've got our net of £10 plus our VAT of £2 equals £12, which is our gross figure. But let's think about this. So if we've got our net at 100%, which equals 1, so 10 times 1 is 10, We got our VAT at 20%, which is 0.2. So we worked out our VAT by 10 times 0.2. We can actually jump, if we know the VAT rate, we can jump from our net amount to our gross amount without having to calculate the VAT in the middle as a sort of separate thing, okay? And the way we can do that is we can say, well, okay, our gross amount is 120%. So if 100% is equal to 1 and 20% is equal to 0.2, then our 120% must equal 1.2 in the decimal format. So if we then take our £10, or this £10 item that we've got here, we're then going to say, so we've got £10, there's our item amount, that's our net amount here. We're going to multiply that by the gross amount here, and that is going to give us our £12 gross figure, which you can see is how we work that out. So it doesn't matter what your VAT rate is, providing you split it down into decimals. Because if you had a VAT rate of 30%, your net would still remain 100, so therefore it'd equal 1. Your VAT rate would be 30%, which would equal 0.3, and then your gross would be 130%, which would equal 1.3. So hopefully that gives you, we're going to do some working examples shortly, but hopefully that gives you an overview of why I use that basis. Because if the VAT rate went up to 30%, your divide by 6 and times by 5 isn't really going to work. So I always try and base it on the decimal, and then you can work it out on any VAT rate that you're given. Okay, so let's look at another example then before we go on to a slightly different style question. So here we're going to have an item that costs £5,693 before VAT. So we know we're going to have to add VAT on, so the number's going to get bigger. So we know this isn't our biggest number. So therefore it's going to have to be our net amount. Our net amount equals 100%, so in decimals that's 1. Our VAT is going to be equal to 20%, and in decimals that is 0.2. So always think of it in relation to your net, because that's always 100%. So your VAT is going to be 0.2 of your net, is 20% of your net. Okay, so your VAT is going to be 5693 times 0.2. So your VAT will be 1138.60. So therefore your gross is going to be your net plus your VAT. And that is going to give you your overall total of 6831.60. So that's our largest number, it's our gross. So let's prove it by doing our net figure multiplied what gross actually means. So gross is 120% of your net, which is 1.2. Times it by 1.2, and I'm just going to check my workings here on my calculator, and that still comes out at 6831.60, which matches that. So that's how you're going to add VAT onto an item. The next example here, is working out when you've got something that's already including VAT. So let's have a look. We've got an item here that costs 500. It's including VAT. So what is the net VAT and gross amounts? Okay, so if it's including, it means that it's the biggest amount. So that £500 means it's the biggest amount. So therefore, straight away, we know that our 500 has to be equal to our gross amount. It's our biggest amount. So don't forget, our gross has to equal the largest. Okay, and again, we're going to just assume that our VAT rate is 20%. So if £500 is our gross amount, how are we going to work out what our net and our VAT amount is? So let's look at it. Our gross amount, we know, is going to be equivalent to 120% of our net. Let's move that into decimals. So that's 1.2 of our net. So in order to work out the net, we then have to do our gross amount, £500. And if we were adding it on, we would be multiplying by 1.2. But this time we want to take it out. So we want to see what our net amount is before VAT. So we do 500 divided by 1.2. So we're taking the VAT out this time, which then gives us a VAT amount of 416.6, and we just round it up to 67. Okay. That is then our net amount, my apologies. Okay, so that is going to be our net amount there. So we know our net amount equals 100, and therefore it equals 1. So now we've got our gross and our net. To work out our VAT, it's going to be the difference between the two. So you could do a simple sum of your 500 minus 416.67, and then that would give you your VAT amount of 83.33, which is going to be your 20% or your 0.2. So when you're thinking of it, always convert it to decimals. But if we wanted to prove it, how could we prove it? So to prove it, we would want to be doing our net amount multiplied by our how to get our gross amount, which would be 1.2, or we can multiply our net amount by 0.2 to check that we actually get our VAT amount. Okay, so I'm going to do our net amount, our net amount that we've just calculated, which is 416.67. I'm going to multiply it by 0.2, and that gives me 83.33. And that's our VAT. So that's our VAT rate here. And then our gross amount, just to double check that we've got everything correct, would be 416.67 multiplied by 1.2, and that will then give us our gross amount, because our gross amount is always 120% of our net amount, which is then going to be £500, and that equals our original amount up here. Let's work through another just so that we can really understand it. So this time we have an item that costs £11,280, including VAT. So because it's including, we know that it's going to be the largest. So straight away we can see that our gross amount, which is equal to 120% of our net amount, which equals 1.2, that is £11,280. 280. So what's our net amount then? Our net amount, we only want 100%, 1. So we're going to do 11,280. We're going to divide it by 1.2. And when you do that calculation, I'll do it here with you as well, 11,280 divided by 1.2. And that gives 9,400. So now we know our gross and our net, we can either do our VAT is equal to 11,280, take away our net amount, so we can work it out that way with a simple subtraction, or we can do our net amount, but what we now know is our net amount, 9,400, we can multiply that by 0.2 because we know our VAT rate is 20%. And then that still gives us, if we just check our workings, it still gives us that figure that we worked out previously, 1,880. So let's just check. So with our net equaling 9,400, how could we work out our gross directly from that net amount? Our net amount equals 100. Our gross amount must be 1.2 of net, must be 120% of net. So we can multiply our net of 9,400, doing it together with you, and that will bring you back to the original amount that you were given for your gross. So hopefully that makes some more sense for those that are including VAT. So work out what your VAT percentage is, work out what your gross percentage is going to be. So your gross is always going to be your 100 plus your VAT amount. Your net will always be 100, and your VAT obviously is whatever percentage you're given in the question. Work that out as a decimal and then apply it into your formulae. So lastly, I've just got a couple more on what if you're only given the VAT amount. Well, believe it or not, you can still work everything out. So let's have a look at this. We have a VAT amount of 850. So what's the net and gross value? So our VAT is equal to 20% of any net value we are given, okay? Which is equal to 0.2. Our net, therefore, if normally to get our VAT amount, it would equal our net times our percentage, so times our decimal amount, and that would give us our VAT amount. So in order to get our net amount, we then need to divide our VAT amount by the VAT rate. So our net is actually going to be 850 divided by 0.2. We all do that together, which gives us a figure of 4,250. And that's going to be our 100%. Okay? So again, now we could work out our gross. We can work out our gross by doing 4,250 and then plus our 850 would give us 5,100 because that is our gross amount, that is our largest amount. Or if we've got our net amount, we can work it out the other way, because our net amount times 1.2 will give us our gross amount. So 4,250 times 1.2, let's do it together, 4,250 times 1.2 equals £5,100, which is equal to what we worked out there. So if you've got your VAT, instantly you can work out your net amount as long as you know what the VAT rate is. So it's all about moving your formulae around, okay? So you've got your VAT equals net times 0.2, and you've got gross equals net times 1.2, and then you can also do net equals your gross divided by 1.2. So they're kind of your general formulae there at the top that you can work in any way, in any which way you need to for the question. So let's just do these before we finish. So an item has a VAT amount, so we're just talking about VAT amount here, of 2679. What is the net and gross value using that VAT amount? Okay, so our VAT is going to be our 20% VAT rate. So to work out our net, so let's think about what we worked out on the other side, is that to work out VAT, it's net times 0.2. So to work out the net part of it, we need to then divide the VAT by 0.2. Okay, so 2679 divided by 0.2. Now, will this give us a funny answer? Nope. So 13,395. Okay, that's our net amount. So if it's our net amount, we know that it's 100%, therefore it's got to be 1 in decimal. So our gross, we can work it out as 13,395 plus our 2679. And that's our biggest amount, that's our gross amount. But how else do we work out our gross? Well, our gross is equal to our net amount multiplied by 1.2, because our gross must equal 120% of our net. So let's check our figures. If we know our net amount, 13,395, let's multiply that out by our 1.2, and that gives us 16,074, which matches the amount that we've worked out there. And just reverse what we've done for the net, just so that we can be absolutely sure. 13,395 multiplied by what our VAT would be, our VAT percentage in a decimal, which is 0.2. If you do that on your calculators, you will come back to the original VAT amount that we were given of £2,679. Okay, so just remember how you can change your formulae around in order to work out whatever part it is that you haven't been given. So providing you're given a VAT rate, then you should be able to work out your net, gross and VAT of any given figure, depending on what figure it is, using the decimal way, using your hundreds, your 120s and your 20s if the VAT rate is 20%. So just as a final recap then, your VAT, your VAT means value added tax. It's a consumption tax that's added to goods and services in the EU. VAT rates can change, so that's really important because you always must check your question to see what actual VAT rate they've given you, and are the amounts including or excluding VAT. The most consistent way of calculating VAT is the decimal way, which is what we've just been doing just now, so turn everything into a decimal. You divide the VAT to give the by 100 to give the decimal figure, your net plus VAT equals gross. So remember that gross is the largest word, so it has to include everything. And make sure you can work out your VAT in a number of ways based on the figures given to you. So just like we've worked out what your net VAT and gross amount is when it's excluding VAT, work it out when it's including VAT, and work it out when you're just given a VAT amount and a VAT rate. And at the end of the day, practice does make perfect with this. It's just about keep going, get the maths going, and just make sure that you can be confident in moving those formulae around, understanding what figures you're given in the question, and be confident that you know what you're doing. So good luck in all your exams, and just keep practicing, and you will eventually get there.